Hey, how you guys doing? Are we good? Okay. So I think we're gonna get started. Everybody's out there trying to make it to happy hour. I'm gonna introduce myself and then we're gonna go around and just let everybody do a quick intro and then we're just gonna jump into the questions. Hopefully have 10, 15 minutes at the end to answer any questions, if that sounds good to everyone. So with that, my name is Dan McGraw. I am the head of Americas for Carbon Pulse, which is a news and analytics site. And then you want to start, Katelyn?
Sure. I'm Katelyn Roedner Sutter with Environmental Defense Fund. I'm based in Sacramento, but I work as part of our U.S. climate team on carbon policy, both in California and in other states as well. Been with EDF a few years and was really involved in the 2017 extension of the California Cap and Trade Program, the subsequent regulatory updates, and since then have been sort of thinking about how California can be helpful in other states and jurisdictions.
Great. Thank you. My name is JP Brisson. I am an avid subscriber and reader of Carbon Pulse. What I do every day when I get to the office, I read the articles that Dan has written previous day, and basically go on and advise my clients on that basis. I also happen to be a partner at Latham and Watkins, which is a firm with 2,500 lawyers by now. I co-chair a group that advises companies in connection with climate change issues. I started in this space 20 years ago at the World Bank, and I've worked previously at Goldman Sachs. And pleasure to be here with you guys.
Excellent. My name is Scott Hernandez. I work at CBL Markets in New York. We operate a spot exchange for environmental commodities, including carbon emissions, as well as renewable energy and voluntary carbons. So we're very pleased to be part of this panel and these great speakers, and thanks to the Climate Action Reserve for the opportunity to participate.
Cool. So without kind of hemming and hawing about the the most interesting thing that I think is happening right now in California, we're just going to jump into it. And one of the things that you've seen in the past with California carbon allowances in the secondary market is that we've kind of slowly trudged along to the next year's floor price. This year, we've followed a very unconventional or different path, and we've definitely surged past the 2020 levels. We've approached the 2020 floor levels. A lot more volume coming into the exchanges, a lot more interest just in general. So, I just want to start with you, Scott. What's driving this trend, and does it have the potential to have a little bit more of a staying power than kind of some of the other run-ups that we've seen in CCA pricing?
Yeah, I definitely think it does have some staying power. I think, if you think back to when the program launched in 2013, and you even had the delay back then, and you've had a series of kind of stops and starts, with the program, whether there's legal challenges or uncertainty about the extension of the program. So, I think for the first time in several years, you've got some length in the market and some certainty, and that's driving new participants into the space. So, I think maybe there were a lot of people sitting on their hands waiting to see what the extension of the program was going to mean before they jumped fully back in. And prior to that, I think it was you just don't have the same level of interest from speculators and some funds and some of the more financial side of the market. So I think that the view in the market was that I think the prices were undervalued, and now I think people are coming in and they're seeing value in the market, and even with the oversupply, I think you have some people who are taking profits on their holdings from purchases that they've made in the auction over the past few years, and you have new entrants coming in and fueling that demand.
So whenever I got into this market, which was right around 2013, I quickly met JP. So JP's an old hat kind of in this market, and he's seen, much like myself, seen some of the highs and lows of this program. Do you get a sense that kind of what we're experiencing now is a different scenario, a different play? It's a little bit different than those rallies that we've seen in the past?
Right. No, I think it is, and I will agree with what Scott has said. You may remember we've had this panel for 3 years in a row now, and maybe 3 years ago, I think I came into this room and I said, look, you guys may think everything's cool, everything's cool and everything, but let me tell you, in Sacramento, there are significant forces clashing with each other, and I think I expressed the view that I wasn't sure what the outcome would be, right? I said it is actually possible that cap and trade as a policy will not be pursued. I mean, there was a time where this was a real risk. And, I don't want to repeat what we've said, in other panels or in past years, but truly the adoption of AB 398 was a crucial step in establishing the certainty. And just to remind everyone, I was very close in the negotiation of 398. The bill is a law that, first of all, removed the uncertainty as to, the length of the program. So until we had AB 398, there were some market participants and stakeholders who were taking the view that cap and trade could not go beyond 2020, right? So the first thing that AB 398 did is it extended the program through 2030 at a minimum, right? So that's a very big signal. The second thing that AB 398 did is it's a supermajority bill. Again, we tend to forget about this now, but the lack of a supermajority vote for AB 32 from a legal perspective was opening up a risk that the program could be challenged, including the ability of the state to run some auctions, right? So again, the fact that industry and a two-third majority of the legislature came together for 398 was another very important signal that essentially reinforced the legal strength of the program. And finally, something that I believe is fundamental, 398 was a bipartisan bill. Republicans supported, 8 of them, supported this legislation, which is a huge statement in terms of the, fairly strong consensus in the middle in California that climate programs are not only important but should be here for the long run. So these 3 aspects of 398, I believe, provided the certainty around the framework that the market needed. And I think it is within that framework that we are seeing now this renewed interest by new market participants and renewed demand for the existing products, which is resulting in higher prices.
And I mean, one of the things that you saw is, so the ARB finished and approved the regulations that kind of conform the current regulation to AB 398
Yes.
in December, and from basically the jump of 2019, we've kind of followed that trend of just, steadily like hitting our stride, having more people come into the market, a little bit more liquidity, more activity. Just kind of how we kind of cleared all those hurdles, and we're reaching our stride here in California, and we can just kind of buckle down and say, this is a market, it's got stability, we can start working on emissions, we don't have to worry about the things that are on the sidelines, lawsuits, regulatory action. We've got a path to 2030, and we can just go for it. I don't know if there's a question there.
No, I don't know if you're, so first of all, you referred to the regulation, right? Mm-hmm. So indeed, 398, I told you 3 years ago, I said, I'm not sure where this is going to go. We had 398, but then last year I came in and I said, well, I don't know where the regulatory package is going to go. And that was a fight in itself. Yeah. But we ultimately, and I'm looking at EDF here because EDF is a very important stakeholder in all of these discussions, whether it is the law or the regulation. But we ultimately got those regulations, adopted and promulgated by the state board, and they became effective earlier this month. So from that perspective, I believe for the most part, we're set. Now, there are a couple of sore losers who are still making noise around, oversupply, I apologize for my term, but there are some people who are not convinced that the oversupply issue is being completely addressed. So I think that is a source of continued conversation. But as far as I can tell right now, it is on the margin, right? I will stop and let other people comment, but I have other comments on the actual prices because there's one thing. I'm not sure that the run on the prices will necessarily continue. I think we are basically getting where it should be, but maybe that's a separate conversation. Well,
I mean, we can have that right now. I mean, honestly, there's nobody out there that's going to fight us on this. So, I mean, the fact that, traditionally, if you looked at pricing, we've used the valuation point of, the following year's floor price.
Right.
And I think right now you can make a realistic argument that strategy and that trading behavior has been put in the dumpster and lit on fire. And people are saying that might not be the valuation point. Maybe the valuation point is when this program is physically annually short or physically cumulatively short, which is in the post-2020 program, which when we started in 2013 sounded like ages ago, but it's a year away.
Yes.
So, do you think that are we a new normal? You guys both can kind of talk about this. Is kind of the trajectory that we're on, is it a new normal, or is this a blip on the radar and we're just going to kind of realign and people say, hey, trading the 2020 floor in April makes zero fucking sense?
I think it'll stabilize. I think what, as we've talked, kind of these barriers have been removed, these uncertainties have kind of been peeled away one by one over the past, 2 years. And I think what you're seeing is kind of a little bit of a froth, or, people coming into the market. And I think, that things will kind of, come to an order. Where that price discovery will be, or whether it has a lot, more to go, that remains to be seen. But I think that things will stabilize, and maybe it'll be a new normal that is created.
And we kind of talked about this before, but one of the things, if you go back and you look traditionally at markets, carbon markets specifically, you've seen these general freakouts, these slow periods, and then a general freakout. If you look at the U.S. side, Reggie had a pretty hard freakout in that 2014, 2015, and then it decided to go in the dumpster for a little bit. And now you're seeing California that's definitely taken off. You've seen a similar behavior that happened in EU ETS. Can you kind of see some parallels between these markets where each one of them's kind of hit their stride more or less?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really interesting time. If you look at the extension and the program review in Reggie, and then also the policies that have been implemented in the EU with the backstop, and it's not too dissimilar to what's kind of occurring in California, I think. Obviously, the over-allocation and what remains to be done with unsold allowances, I think obviously there's still work to be done, but they can look at what's happened in the EU as well as Reggie with the emissions containment reserve, which I think is a really innovative policy. But it's actually quite interesting to look, and kind of all these programs have kind of, like you say, been in the dumpster or been on fire at various stages, and now you're seeing a point where there's new length in all of them and a lot more confidence in the market. So it's kind of interesting they've all coalesced around that kind of same time. Yeah,
and I think it's interesting, like each one of these markets, they've whenever they sensed a problem, the EU, Reggie, California, whenever they've kind of fallen into these pitfalls, they've gone in and said, what do we need to do to fix them? Mm-hmm. And more or less, every single one of these regulators has done a very good job of finding the tweaks along the way.
Yeah. I kind of agree, but I think it's important to distinguish between a few things, right? So first of all, you referred to the Reggie rally from several years ago. If I remember correctly, this rally was on the back of a belief that Reggie allowances would be grandfathered under the Obama Clean Power Plan program, right? To me, 2020 hindsight, of course, this was an overly simplistic assumption, and maybe not fully in account of the risk associated with that prediction not happening for a number of reasons. And then ultimately, so that rally in the market was created by this in my view, unreasonable expectation of a federal policy driver, right? Then the market slumped, and then the RGGI states intervened to constrain supply, right? Now in California, we haven't had an action by the state constraining supply yet. And the mechanisms that are in the regulation have been there for quite some time, right? There's one measure, which is unsold allowances, are not offered in the market for some time. You need to have two auction clearing above the price floor for these allowance to come back, and then there's a 25% rule, and then there's a 24-month rule. I don't want to be in details, but the point is we haven't, none of those have actually changed recently in a way that would create, I believe, in my personal view, the rally that we're seeing. I believe the rally that we've seen recently, and it's an explanation that is worth not much because it's coming from me, but I think if you look at the forward curve, what you saw in California is that the future deck products on ice, for example, trading below the price floor for those future years at a discount that was significantly higher than the cost of capital. And the only explanation for that is a perception by the market that there was a risk that the program would not be there.
Yep.
Right? Now that this risk is, in my view, pretty much gone away because of 398 and the regulation that were implemented by ARB and that took effect like this month, that risk is gone. So I think if the math wizards here, if you start running some math with the cost of capital with a 2020 deck or 2021 deck and you bring it back to today, you actually start seeing that the market is just rationally assuming that the program will be in place, that these products will be delivered in 2020, 2021, and the only thing we're seeing is an adjustment based on the fact that there's now an expectation that these products will be delivered at those dates.
Yeah, it's a different valuation point. Go ahead.
So I am not one of those math wizards, nor a trader. So I will, I want to tell you how great we're doing reducing emissions. But I think the thing to add to this is if you look post 2020, to the trajectory to our 2030 target in California is way steeper than what we have been on right now. So, the market has to tighten because the cap just tightens so much. So I think that's a really important factor in sort of thinking about why is the market behavior what it is now? Because we're looking at a future where there's a lot less supply out there.
Yeah, but I think that's a great point. I actually think that ultimately that is the long-term trajectory of the prices. I personally don't see that baked into the forward curve today, which is very interesting. What I'm seeing now is just people making a calculation, what will be the future prices of these products given the 5% increase every year, plus the inflation cost, right? And can I buy something to be delivered in 2021 today and deliver it at that price, which will increase over time, without losing any money? It's almost a no-risk proposition. What I look forward to seeing is whether, when we meet here next year, is whether people will start thinking about the trajectory post-2020 and then layer on top of the price floor a premium to reflect the stringency of the cap decline.
You can probably talk about this. One of the things that you look at from like an environmental standpoint is if we have a price that just runs across the floor, do you get the emission reductions? Do you get the incentives to reduce emissions that you need? Or when you look out to 2027, 2028, do you need to have a higher price to bring some of those emission reductions that are actually inside, call it inside the money and viable?
Yeah, I think certainly we're looking towards a future where we have a higher carbon price. I think we certainly need to have a higher carbon price to drive the kind of reductions that we need to see in California. I don't think it's a question of if. I think that's exactly what was going to have to happen. So.
And what kind of piggybacking off of that, one of the things that you look at is during this 6-year time span more or less a lot of the emission reductions that have happened in cap and trade have come from the power sector. You haven't really seen any reasonable reductions from the transportation sector. The ARB's kind of talked about this. You've had some discussions with IEMAC. So, I mean, it gets down to that question, like, how does California actually ensure that you're going to get these emission reductions from this sector, which is, you know, it's not easy.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it is true. Over the last few years, the transportation emissions in California have slowly ticked up. And, you know, Secretary Blumenfeld talked about this morning, transportation emissions are a huge part of California's overall emissions, but also global emissions. So it's a sector that, you know, can't be discounted. I think, you know, a couple things related to that. You know, we shouldn't forget that overall, the state of California is 4 years ahead of schedule to meet its 2020 target. So, I mean, overall, we have good news. And we have seen significant reductions in the electricity sector and are starting to see good reductions in other sectors as well. And I mean, that is how you want an efficient market to work. Like, you're finding the most cost-effective reductions first. This is the benefit of having an economy-wide program. I think another piece is there's maybe preliminary, early good news about transportation emissions. And that is that, so from 2012 to 2017, gas and diesel consumption in the United States, or excuse me, in California increased every single year. And then in 2018, it looks like that consumption like actually went down a little bit. So I mean, that could be an early indicator of where our transportation emissions are going. You know, I'm really anxious to see the early data come out in June on our emissions inventory overall, but specific transportation emissions in California, and see what that looks like. But all of that being said, transportation emissions cannot be ignored, whether it's here in California, federally, or globally. You know, Jared talked about the impact not only on the climate, but on local air quality and the public health concerns around these transportation emissions. So, and it's a tricky thing because that sector is also tied up in you know, land use change and housing shortages and housing affordability and our, you know, disinvestment in public transit, and all of these things are things that the state needs to address still. You know, we're really focused on electrification of medium and heavy duty vehicles. Just, it's an area that has a significant impact, and you know, we haven't done as much there as in other, you know, with passenger vehicles. So yeah, there's potential good news out there, but there's a lot more to be done, is the takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you look at the data and you look at especially the way that we forecasted out emissions from the fuel sector, you probably, it's likely that you're going to see a slight dip this year compared to the previous years, which is, you know, a good thing. But then it ultimately comes down to, is that a product of consumption or is that a product of policy? Sure. And ultimately, you need to get more emission reductions that kind of aren't just driven by the economics of gas prices.
Yeah.
But you talked about oversupply. Which is kind of an interesting thing, because I think if you look at it and you frame it in the view of an environmental person, we're more successful than we thought we would be at this point. But if you look at it from a different perspective, you could say the market is oversupplied, it has some problems. So, I mean, how do you kind of balance those frames that, you know, we're doing more than we're expected to, but the market is actually having some surplus out there?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember the significance of looking at our cumulative reductions. So getting early emission reductions is good for our atmosphere. It's good for the climate. I mean, the earlier we get those, the better. So I mean, it's a really good thing that we're ahead of schedule. And you know, I understand some of the concern about oversupply, but I think what we need to look at is our cumulative emission reductions and make sure that is on track, because that is ultimately the purpose of this program, is to reduce pollution and reduce climate emissions. So if we are on track to do that, then you know we're doing good work from an environmental perspective.
And I'll throw this over to JP. I mean, when you look at kind of where we are with the oversupply? Is it something that we should be a concern? Should be a concern to the market for the post 20 goals, where we're going to go in the future?
What did you mention? What was that word again?
Post 20
No,
goals.
over what?
Oversupply.
I've never heard of that. I didn't think it existed. One of the most significant debate in 398 when it was adopted, and last year when the regulations were promulgated by ARB, was whether the market is oversupplied, right? So I do not believe that's the case, but I think fundamentally there are maybe two elements that need to be kind of clarified, right? So I think some have expressed concern that there are too many allowances that are needed to comply, and that somehow in 2020 or 2030, all of the compliance entities are going to use all of the allowances that were banked and somehow use them to comply in 2030, as a result of which, the compliance will be a compliance on paper only, that the actual reduction in California will be higher than, what the program shows. And I believe that is I do not agree with this argument for a number of reasons. First, there's a legal reason, right? It is not true legally that California law provides for specific target by specific years that must be achieved, comes hell or high water. It provides for, I'm the lawyer, it provides for a trajectory of emissions that the state agency, ARB, must achieve over time using the tools that it has at its disposal. I'll give you an example.
Your argument is a future goal an annual target, or is it an aggregate?
It is in the aggregate. It is not an annual target. So I'll give you an example.
But can it be both?
No, by definition, by law, it is not annual.
Then why is California saying that they're at their 2020 goal 2 years in advance?
Well, that's a policy statement.
2016 emission levels are already at our 1990 levels.
Which is an annual level.
So
Yeah, but if you-
that's why I'm saying we haven't
Yeah.
met it. We're 4 years ahead of schedule
Yeah.
to meet
Yeah,
it.
but AB 32 says in the aggregate. The words aggregate are in the law. The word aggregate is in the law. Let me just give you a very simplistic example. What if ARB structured in the entire program so that the state met the goal in 2030 annually, but exceeded the goal by 2x the 10 years that follows 2030, right? Do you think someone would have a problem with that? And do you think someone could legally sue the state for not complying with AB 32? For sure, they'll have a very strong case, right? Yeah. It is an aggregate. It is a target over the long run, 2050, 2030. It is an aggregate reduction, and the state has the agency has the obligation under the law to develop a program that's going to take the state as a whole towards that target. Right? And it needs to show progress incrementally towards that goal, and the policy must be rationally developed and well supported by the evidence in the record to achieve that goal. If the agency does that, that's what the law requires, and that's what ARB has done.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think if you look at the oversupply and you hear the counter opinion to that the market is oversupplied. You had a lot of people that said, look, there's 200 million allowances that are from CP1, CP2 that are sitting in compliance accounts that obviously are surplus allowances that could be used for future emissions. The price is more or less running around the floor or running off of the next year's floor. But now we're getting into a different scenario. Now one of those elements and one of those evidence pieces is gone. So if you say, this rally is different, this rally is real, it has more certainty. Can you look at the rally, both of you guys can answer this, look at the rally and say, this is proof that the market isn't oversupplied or the oversupply isn't problematic for us to reach our 2030 goals?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you look at the oversupply and a lot of the, the math wizards have put together some pretty good forecasts, there seems to be a consensus that it's going to be oversupplied out to 2026 or 2027. But the rate of the decrease, which I think is forecast to kind of kick in, where the oversupply actually starts to fall off in 2021. So, if you're getting to the end of the program and you've corrected the issues through the markets and through the tools that the program already has within it, then I think that you've achieved your goal. So, I don't think there's much to debate.
Do you want to jump in?
I was to say, I think you talked about the end of the program. I think, another way to address this is not talk about the end of the program in 2030, but how about 2050?
Sure.
If we set a cap out to 2050 in statute and plan out to 2050, I mean, how much of this problem goes away?
Well, let's do something interesting. Let's do a show of hands here. Who in this room believe that everything's going to stop in 2030 and everyone over here will go home and do nothing or do something else, but that essentially cap and trade will fall off a cliff in 2030 and the state will not continue the program? Who believes that rationally? Raise your hand. Okay.
Way to ask a loaded question.
Sorry. Does anyone, okay, let me ask you, who believes that the program will be continued in 2031? Raise your hand. Okay, well, that's a little easier, right? But, I mean, the point is the expectation that somehow the program will not be continued after 2030, given the numerous executive orders that we have and the numerous references that we have in the law, including the 2045 climate neutrality goal set by Governor Brown. I mean, that would not be a rational assumption. So I fully agree with you, Katelyn. I mean, if you think about it that way, then the oversupply argument is not very well supported.
Yeah, and I also think that whenever you're talking about the oversupply and the fact that you're going to get to the 2030 goal, I mean, right now the market's oversupplied by 243 million allowances. Annual emissions are well above that. So you're saying right now the annual surplus wouldn't cover a full year's worth of emissions. So I don't know if you can necessarily say people are going to spread 243 million allowances all the way out to 2030.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears a little bit because this is North America and we don't need to be so California-centric, even though we're in LA. So one of the things that you are seeing is you're seeing a little bit of expansion just across North America. You've got New Jersey, all but certain to link with RGGI. Hopefully Virginia does, unless they have some other scandal that pops up in the next 2 months. You've also got Oregon making some moves. So I mean, can you talk a little bit about kind of that expansion and maybe what is the next frontier of we've got these 3 states, what's the 4th, what's the 5th, what's the 6th that we have to watch?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really exciting time, actually. I mean, if you're into carbon markets, it's a really exciting time. But Oregon certainly tops the list. The legislature is on track to adopt this session an economy-wide cap and trade program that is, the foundation of which is intended to link with Western Climate Initiative at some point down the road. It's another step in future negotiations, but as legislative leadership and the governor's office and advocates have really worked tirelessly in Oregon, I mean, that's one of those goals that's out there. So it's really exciting. A lot of work has gone into Oregon in developing this program, and they're ready to go. The leadership is on board. The advocates are fired up. It is go time in Oregon right now, and I think we are really going to see some exciting stuff come out of Salem this session. So that is really great news. But it's not just Oregon. I mean, it's not just the West Coast. Certainly Virginia, you mentioned, is making some impressive progress towards joining RGGI, and I think both Oregon and Virginia are seeing, the benefits of joining a well-established, successful market. The benefits, you have greater liquidity and you have lower administrative costs and more trading partners. I mean, all of these things are obvious to those states, I think, is my observation. But it doesn't stop there. I mean, Pennsylvania, for instance, not necessarily the state that would be like my top 5 list of climate leaders, but they are thinking about some really interesting work there. The regulators in Pennsylvania are considering what is essentially a citizen's petition to create an economy-wide cap-and-trade program. Wow. And if they continue to, they've already taken concrete steps moving forward there, and if they continue to do that, at some point down the road, Pennsylvania could even theoretically link with WCI. So that's an exciting perspective, thing to think about too. At minimum, I think it means Pennsylvania could consider linking with RGGI maybe in the shorter term, especially since Pennsylvania is already working with I think it's 8 other eastern states and the District of Columbia on the Transportation Climate Initiative. So basically an initiative to create a cap and trade program for the transportation sector. So you see these movements toward expanding existing markets, not only to new states, but also into new sectors. So there's some good movement out there.
I kind of want to come back to JP on this, and
Sure.
we haven't really talked about this, but you've talked about Pennsylvania, you've talked about Oregon. Some of these are being led by citizens. Mm-hmm. If you reverse it all the way back to 2015, 2016, we had the Clean Power Plan, and you had a whole lot of discussion about, we're going to have a Midwest, RGGI-like program. We're going to have this, Western WCI market. All this stuff's going to expand. Now we're almost 4 years in the future. We've got the ACE. We don't have the CPP. We're, kind of still trying to figure out what the hell mass versus EPA means. Is there the potential that, in the future, definitely in the post-2020 program, that we get a federal incentive to maybe have, a Pennsylvania cap and trade program, Nevada cap and trade program, a Utah cap and trade program? Do you see any kind of legal remedy to the whole mass versus EPA? I know I didn't ask you this question before.
Yeah, no, that was not on your list.
Yeah, it was not on my list.
I remember that.
Yeah.
The disclaimer is I'm not a big litigation guy, and there are, people in my firm and maybe in the room here who are far better qualified than me to answer. I never thought that the litigation route was the way to bring people together. I'd rather find ways to incentivize them instead. So I personally don't see a clear road. I see, though, some levers that maybe, merit some discussion, right? So I think for as you may know, I live in New Jersey and I work in New York. It's very interesting that RGGI, as you may know, does not cover imports of power the way California does it, right? And in New York, a lot of the power coming into New York, some of it comes from Quebec, where I'm from, but that's upstate New York. But in Manhattan, we have a lot of power coming from PJM, which is one of the most, largest power pools in the U.S. And it's very strange that you have all of this power coming from Pennsylvania, which is heavy, high intensive emissions power, coming into New York, and you have, far more efficient resources in New York State and in, the Northeast having to compete without the price of carbon. So, the absence of a regulation of the imports, to me, has always been a big question mark. Now, there are some things happening, right? So New York is actually considering a carbon adder, right? It's not even New York, it's the New York ISO, which is the equivalent of, CAISO here. So that will be very interesting because going forward, it may provide a way to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. That may be a runaround situation where you cannot have a comprehensive cap and trade program, at least for the power sector. And the other development that I wanted to mention is, in Massachusetts, as some of you may know, Massachusetts felt RGGI doesn't do a good job at,
I believe the courts decided that RGGI does not do enough.
Well, okay, so
to fulfill the Global Warming Solutions Act, they needed to do more.
you see, he knows more than I do. So, but they have their own sub-program, right? Well, maybe you can. But so it's interesting that.
Yeah, I mean, like Massachusetts had Global Warming Solutions Act. You had some environmental groups that sued the state, saying that they weren't fulfilling the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Massachusetts rightfully said, no, we are. We're in RGGI. Which has an annual cap, and then the court came back and said, no, you actually have to have an annual limit, and so they've more or less proposed a compliance-only program that slowly ratchets down emissions from, I believe, 21 facilities that is separate, completely separate, and siloed away from RGGI, but it has a lot of, I don't know, hat tips towards RGGI.
Yeah.
But I mean, it gets back to this whole dynamic that, you know, in the absence of a federal push, you have this patchwork and you have states kind of fill in the void where they can and trying to say, you know, if we want to reach these goals, we can't just sit on our hands and wait for, you know, Donald Trump to decide that,
Exactly.
you know, climate change is not a hoax from the Chinese.
That's right. That's right. And so I think, like Katelyn, I share a lot of optimism that this trend will continue. Where I sometimes worry about is when, you know, people want to try a new solution, not because I think new solutions are not good, but because I think then it makes linkage more difficult. So, you know, first of all, this idea that the RGGI states are exploring TCI outside of the RGGI construct, to me, is a little worrying.
Oh, I think that makes perfect sense.
You do?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I sat through 18 months of RGGI program review, and that was 9 states. And now you've got 13, and you're talking about a hell of a big idea. So I think it makes perfect sense if you're TCI, you say, look, this is a big issue. This is, you know, fundamental to where we want to go, because for the most part, I think the power sector economics are going to get you where you need to go, minus a few things here and there, a few incentives. But transportation emissions are completely different. You're talking about you have to change consumer behavior, and sometimes, you know, it's tough. I mean.
But I just want to make sure that we disagree or agree on being on the same page. Are you suggesting that transportation should be handled in a separate regulatory program because of that? Or are you saying just the process needs to be separate, but eventually you see them coming together?
Yeah, I think you can sync them together at a later date, but I think siloing them away and basically saying this is its own problem, we need to figure out this problem away from RGGI, because once you slam those together, it further complicates that problem.
Right. So
where it's easy, like example, California created a program and they melded them all together and said, hey, we're phasing you guys in 2015. But they were building it together.
Yeah.
It's different to say, hey, I've got this old beat up car and I'm just gonna randomly add things onto it, and then it turns into, you know, just complete train wreck. Rather than hey, let's functionally merge them together in the future because it makes more sense. You can kind of be a little bit more proactive.
I think it's more of the art of the possible. It's you know, what sectors are politically pragmatic to where you can actually achieve, you know, an environmental goal. And you know, it would be great if we did have, you know, a centralized leadership from, you know, the federal level. But you know, what we do is have a patchwork of sectors and states that, you know, chose to take that leadership in the absence of a federal push. So, you know, that does make it sticky, and you know, from a market perspective, you know, you don't want to have to reinvent the wheel and learn an entire new program. It would be nice if they're developed around a common set of standards and, you know, can be linked together. But you know, as we know, I guess that's not always the case, and you know, do you have to ask, would we rather not have the program at all, or you know? So you take the advances that you can get, but I do like the idea of melding them together. So
yeah,
maybe.
I would agree. I mean, I think if we ran the world, we could have a fully linked, you know, economy-wide program that we didn't have to sort of do this patchwork piece. But you know, until that happens, I'm really, I think the action at the state level is really important. I think, especially in the United States, it's the state level initiatives that are going to sort of build momentum and build the basis for eventual federal action. I mean, that's where the momentum is going to come from. You know, once the politics shift, we'll have this sort of strong foundation to build up to federal policy. I think it is important that these state level and regional initiatives, you know, have a high level of climate ambition, that they have a high level of environmental integrity. So, you know, I don't want to say that every action is going to get us there, but I don't want to discount what's being done at the state and regional level.
Okay, with that, we have 10 minutes, according to Max, who just told me that. Does anybody have any burning questions? I can barely. Lenny. I think that's Lenny. It's hard to see.
I don't think it is.
I don't think it is.
Hi, my name is Jonah Kerman-Faber. I'm with.
No, it's not. Sorry, apologies.
Is this good? Am I audible, everyone? Yes. My name is Jonah Kerman-Faber with Climate Exchange. We actually focus solely on state-level carbon pricing campaigns, and I wanted to echo a lot of what you said. But for my question, I wanted to say that there's two conflicting perspectives we're seeing play out in all the states we work in. And one of them is this perspective of the perfect policy, and usually with a goal of linking as well. And that the way to achieve climate ambition in the states is to build uniform policy amongst these states over time. And then there's a conflicting perspective that says more pragmatically, this is what we can achieve in this state at this time. And this is going to create a significant disruption for oil and gas or other businesses that are, you know, have to comply with this program. And they're going to fight that confusing environment of policy by advocating for a federal policy once there's enough of a critical mass of conflicting policies. And both of those, you know, theories of change have enough historical precedent and evidence to be somewhat valid. So I'm curious from each of you what your perspective on which one is more your, you know, your theory of change.
I'll let you guys go. I clearly have a lot of opinions about this.
I mean, it's a good question, and you know, I'm personally am struck by the pragmatic approach that, you know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, we don't have time to wait for everything to be perfect. We need to take action now, and if that has to be incremental in certain places, I don't think that should be discounted. I mean, that being said, it needs to be ambitious incremental action. I think the other thing I'd say, you know, you sort of talked about the high bar of getting this perfect policy for linkage. I guess I would also like to think about what are meaningful steps that might not quite be linkage. So like Nova Scotia uses the WCI platform, but they're not linked to the market. Is there a way that that's more accessible to other states and jurisdictions? Is there ways, you know, is there a way to do like a one-way linkage with different states? You know, can there be other models of cooperation that are more accessible to more jurisdictions sooner than maybe full market integration is? I don't necessarily have like the right answer for that, but I mean, it's something that I think is worth exploring because you raise a very important point, and that's a challenge in a lot of places.
You get, I mean,
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question, and I think it relates back to, you know, what is, you know, politically viable, you know, where you're at or the sector that you're in, and you know, that doesn't mean you have to have a perfect policy in place. You know, if you look at the voluntary market, you know, you have corporate actors now who are, you know, making pledges above and beyond, you know, what maybe they would have to do in a compliance situation. So it's really interesting. I mean, you also kind of see a little bit of a convergence on, you know, voluntary into kind of a compliance style. You know, I attended the Latham Watkins session yesterday. We were talking about CEQA, and you know, a good part of our business, we've seen buyers coming in saying, hey, I'm doing environmental review, I need some offsets. So that's not a typical corporate sustainability conversation, but you know, it matches some ambition and you know, furthers the goal using a market mechanism, which I think is really interesting. Kind of similar in the aviation space as well. So
Yeah, and I mean, I would just say that like if your expectation is that you're gonna hit a home run on your cap and trade program, and your policy is gonna be perfect, you're already fucked.
One thing I did want to,
Like
I knew
you're
the
just
F-bomb
like
had
you're
to
just
come
like
somewhere.
you shouldn't have that expectation. Your expectation should be that you're gonna have problems because every single market that's ever been developed has problems, but you need to be pragmatic in the sense that these are issues that are going to pop up, and when they pop up, how are we going to fix them? What happens when we're wrong? And I think if you take that approach that we will be wrong and we will learn from our neighbors in Canada, our neighbors in China, our neighbors in the EU, our neighbors everywhere, then I think you can build on everybody's success, and you can strive for this whole idea of what is a perfect program.
One thing I think is interesting, thinking back to linkage and whether or not states choose to join California or join WCI, do we risk, as the train leaves the station, if pricing, as you say, we already taken a lot of the lower hanging fruit in terms of, emissions reductions. Do you get to a point where, prices are above $20 and, Oregon is like, hey, maybe we don't want to join this program. It's going to cost us so much money.
Yeah.
Is that what people who are going to start advocating against those kind of policies? It's another, quiver, I guess.
Question? Tim Tutt. I think. Retro Jesus.
So 10 years ago, the first state to adopt a cap and trade regulation as part of the WCI was my home state of New Mexico. Political circumstances changed there. Now they've changed again last year. Wondering if there's any activity you're aware of to bring New Mexico back into WCI. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in, I believe it was January, the governor signed an executive order, and I am not going to remember the specific target, but set an ambitious climate pollution reduction goal in line with the IPCC report. And so at this point, the state is looking at how are they going to meet this target, and I wish I could remember the numbers off the top of my head to tell you what it was. But among other things, one thing that they're examining is the possibility of a comprehensive carbon market as a tool towards meeting those ambitious targets that the government has, or the governor has issued in her executive order. So I don't know if there's any specific conversations or plans, but there's certainly potential there. I think, and good potential, and it's exciting to see what the progress, as you said, now that the politics have shifted again, what New Mexico can do.
I think the politics are in the favor. They just raised their RPS, I think, to 50%.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
I have other questions, if you guys don't. Man, I thought with CCAs as high as they were, we'd have some burning questions.
Not enough to sell.
Well, so one of the things that we didn't get to talk about was the voluntary space. And if you look at the voluntary space, we have a decent amount of stuff going on there with people saying, what's the future of the UN aviation program? What's the potential for, hey, I'm corporate Google and I want to reduce. I have a carbon neutrality goal. Can you talk a little bit about just how the voluntary space is also kind of rearranged and realigned over the last few years?
Yeah, no, it's definitely gone through a similar dumpster, I think, fire conversation that you could even compare to other markets. But it's vastly undersupplied. If you talked to me like 2 or 3 years ago, there was an abundance of sellers and everybody was just trying to get rid of it. Now, people are contracted out to the life of a project. So I think you've got investors coming in and people are financing new projects, especially in the biogas space. And you have a lot more diversity of potential buyers, whether it's the warm and fuzzy corporate buyer, or is it someone who's doing a CEQA environmental review there. So there's just a lot more avenues. Or do you even sell it into a Corsia market, that is going to be active before we know it. So I think for sellers, there's just a lot more optimism that you have multiple channels to sell your offsets.
Well,
you can talk about it. They have no questions, so we're going to talk about DEBs next.
About what? No,
Debs.
no one wants to talk about
Yeah.
Debs.
Please define what a DEB is
No, I will not do
and
that.
use it in a sentence.
Yeah, no, I wanted to make an announcement, which is, no one really is going to care, but it's important to me.
I care about everything you say.
Okay, well, we may invite you in to write an article about this, but I am proud to announce that after a year of, maybe 6 months of, consideration, my firm has decided and announced on Monday this week that it will accept to reduce on a voluntary basis its greenhouse gas emissions, Scope 1, Scope 2, by 25% by 2022, which by legal standard is unheard of. So we are, I see a resurgence of interest in the voluntary space. I see services firm like our firm that has 30 offices around the world now, considering things that they would have never thought about 5 years ago. And I believe that, goes hand in hand with ambition, right? So if we want to be ambitious about resolving this issue, we need to be inclusive of sectors who traditionally did not think about, carbon emissions. I'm seeing oil and gas companies such as BP and Shell adopting voluntary target that goes all the way up to their upstreams emissions that are very ambitious by 2045, 2055. I see Chevron that was in the news that is the first company that ties executive pay to how well they manage their greenhouse gas emissions. I think these are all individual measures which maybe in isolation may not be significant, but taken as a whole are, transformational. And I think that in that sector, we just need to be very open-minded. We need to be very flexible because each industry can make a contribution that may be slightly different from another industry, and we just need to value those contributions for what they are, So I'm very excited about this, and I'm seeing a lot of interest in the market for that.
That sounds amazing. We're getting the stop flag, so I want to thank everyone. We'll be hanging around if anybody has any questions that they didn't want to ask on the microphone. So let us know.
Thank you.
Fun times.